My name is Madison Harper, and I'm 32 years old. Standing on these courthouse steps with my hands trembling around legal documents, I can hear my parents behind me. This is absolutely ridiculous, Madison, my father Richard Harper scoffs while my mother Susan shakes her head in disgust. You're being completely delusional if you think this lawsuit will go anywhere. They're laughing at me, calling me the disappointing daughter who never learned her place. But as those heavy courthouse doors swing open and I walk inside with my head held high, I see something that makes my heart race. The Honorable Judge Margaret Foster looks up from her bench, and when I begin to speak, her expression freezes completely. Before we dive into this incredible journey of justice and family betrayal, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below, smash that like button if you're ready for a story that'll leave you speechless, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life drama that proves truth is stranger than fiction. Trust me, what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about family loyalty. Let's begin this wild ride together. Growing up in the Harper Construction dynasty in Dallas, Texas meant living in a world where money spoke louder than love and business came before blood. My father Richard Harper built his empire from the ground up, transforming a small contracting business into one of the most successful construction companies in the state. Our family name was plastered on billboards across the city, our mansion sat in the most exclusive neighborhood, and everyone knew the Harpers meant power and prestige. But behind those perfectly manicured lawns and designer suits lived a family rotting from the inside out. From the moment I could walk, I knew I was different from my older brother Derek. While he was groomed to inherit the throne, taught the ins and outs of construction management and celebrated for every mediocre achievement, I was treated like an expensive decoration that served no real purpose. Derek could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. When he barely scraped by in high school, they celebrated his graduation like he'd cured cancer. When I graduated valedictorian 2 years later, they attended the ceremony but spent the entire time on their phones discussing business deals. The inequality became crystal clear when college applications rolled around. Derek expressed interest in business school, and within days my parents had arranged meetings with admissions counselors at prestigious universities, hired private tutors, and started planning his future office at Harper Construction. When I announced my intention to pursue law, the room fell silent like I'd just declared my plans to join a circus. My father's face twisted into that familiar expression of disappointment that had haunted my childhood. Law school? He repeated, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. Madison, that's an expensive hobby for someone who'll eventually need to focus on finding a good husband and starting a family. But I was determined to prove him wrong. While Derek partied his way through business school on my parents' dime, living in luxury apartments and driving brand new cars they purchased for him, I worked 3 jobs to pay for my legal education. I spent my mornings cleaning office buildings, my afternoons tutoring struggling students, and my evenings waiting tables at an upscale restaurant where my parents occasionally dined with clients. The irony wasn't lost on me when they'd walk past my section without acknowledgement, treating me like just another invisible service worker. The student loans piled up like mountains of debt, but I pressed forward through every exhausting day and sleepless night. I studied in supply closets during breaks, reviewed cases on crowded buses, and wrote papers in 24-hour diners when the libraries closed. My grades were impeccable because they had to be. I had no safety net, no family connections to fall back on, no trust fund waiting in the wings. Everything I achieved came through sheer determination and sacrifice. When Derek graduated with mediocre grades and immediately received a corner office, company car, and vice president title at Harper Construction, I was still struggling through my final year of law school. The injustice burned in my chest like acid, but I channeled that anger into motivation. I would show them that their disappointing daughter had more strength and intelligence than their golden boy ever dreamed of possessing. The day I passed the bar exam should have been the proudest moment of our family's history. I was the first Harper to earn a professional degree, the first to achieve something based purely on merit rather than inheritance. But when I called home with the news, my mother's response crushed whatever naive hope I still carried. "That's nice, dear," she said in the same tone she used to acknowledge the weather. Your father and I are busy preparing Derek's promotion ceremony. He's being named executive vice president next month. That promotion ceremony became the final nail in the coffin of my relationship with my family. Watching Derek accept accolades for a position he'd never earned while I sat in the audience drowning in debt and struggling to establish my own practice was more humiliation than I could bear. During his acceptance speech, Derek actually had the audacity to thank our parents for recognizing true leadership potential and investing in the right child's future. The room erupted in applause while I sat there feeling like my chest had been carved hollow. These people were celebrating mediocrity while completely ignoring the daughter who'd fought tooth and nail for everything she'd achieved. As I watched my parents beam with pride at their chosen heir, a cold realization settled over me. I would never be enough for them. No amount of achievement, sacrifice, or success would ever earn their respect or recognition. But that night, sitting alone in my studio apartment eating ramen noodles while reviewing case files, I made myself a promise. I would build something they couldn't ignore. I would create a legacy based on justice and integrity that would overshadow their empire built on favoritism and inequality. I had no idea that within months, I would uncover secrets that would transform my family's dismissal of me into the foundation for their complete destruction. 2 years after Derek's promotion ceremony, I was barely keeping my solo practice afloat in a cramped office above a dry cleaner in downtown Dallas. The smell of cleaning chemicals constantly wafted through the thin floors, and my desk was actually a folding table I'd bought at a garage sale. Most of my clients were people like me, forgotten, overlooked, and fighting systems designed to crush them. I handled divorce cases for women whose husbands hid assets, worker compensation claims for injured employees whose bosses denied responsibility, and landlord disputes for tenants facing illegal evictions. The work was meaningful but financially devastating. Some months I couldn't afford both rent and food, so I'd choose rent and survive on whatever free samples I could find at grocery stores. My law school classmates were buying houses and luxury cars while I was clipping coupons and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake pursuing justice over profit. But every client I helped reminded me why this struggle mattered. These people needed someone who understood what it felt like to be dismissed and devalued. That's why Jake Morrison's phone call changed everything. Jake had worked for Harper Construction for nearly 8 years as a safety supervisor, and his voice shook with barely controlled rage when he explained why he'd tracked down my number. "I know you're Richard Harper's daughter," he said, "and I know this might be awkward, but I need someone who understands how these corporate criminals operate. Your father's company has been stealing from workers like me for years, and I can prove it." The meeting took place in a diner on the outskirts of town where neither of us would be recognized. Jake arrived with 2 cardboard boxes filled with documents, photographs, and recorded conversations that painted a picture of systematic fraud stretching back over 15 years. As he spread the evidence across our booth, my stomach churned with a mixture of horror and vindication. Everything I'd suspected about my family's business practices was true, and the reality was far worse than I'd imagined. Harper Construction had been systematically stealing wages from workers through a complex scheme of off-the-books labor, falsified timesheets, and bogus deductions for safety equipment that was never provided. Workers were being charged for hard hats, safety vests, and tools they never received, with those fees going directly into a slush fund controlled by my father and Derek. Jake showed me payroll records proving that employees working 60-hour weeks were being paid for 40, with the overtime money disappearing into offshore accounts. The safety violations were even more damaging. Harper Construction was bribing OSHA inspectors to overlook dangerous working conditions that had resulted in 3 worker deaths and dozens of serious injuries over the past decade. My father had a system where injured workers were pressured to claim their accidents happened off-site to avoid worker compensation claims. Those who refused to cooperate were fired and blacklisted from other construction jobs throughout Texas. But the document that made my blood run cold was a tax fraud scheme that involved reporting fake expenses and hiding profits through a network of shell companies. My mother Susan, who I'd always believed simply managed the company's books, was actually the mastermind behind laundering millions of dollars through fake charity organizations and non-existent business partnerships. The sweet, gentle woman who'd raised me was a criminal mastermind hiding behind a facade of suburban respectability. Jake's evidence included recorded phone conversations where Derek laughed about stupid workers who don't know their rights and strategized with my father about keeping the sheep in line. In one particularly damning recording, Derek discussed a worker who'd been permanently disabled in an on-site accident. "We'll offer him $10,000 to sign a waiver," Derek said. "If he refuses, we'll destroy his reputation and make sure he never works in this state again." As I reviewed document after document, a sick realization washed over me. The unpaid internships I'd worked during high school and college weren't learning experiences, they were part of this fraudulent system. I'd been classified as a volunteer worker while actually performing paid labor that my family had stolen from. Even their treatment of their own daughter was part of their criminal enterprise. Jake explained that he'd finally reached his breaking point when Harper Construction refused to pay for medical treatment for a coworker who'd lost 2 fingers in an accident caused by deliberately faulty safety equipment. "That man has 3 kids and no insurance," Jake said, his voice breaking. "Your family would rather let him suffer than spend money on proper medical care for someone they injured through negligence." The evidence was overwhelming, ironclad, and absolutely damning. But Jake's next revelation made everything personal in a way that changed my entire perspective on my family relationships. He pulled out a folder containing internal company memos about problem employees who asked too many questions about safety procedures or payment discrepancies. The list included detailed psychological profiles designed to target workers' vulnerabilities and turn their colleagues against them. "Your brother Derek wrote most of these," Jake explained. "He's got a real talent for destroying people from the inside out." As I read Derek's clinical assessments of how to manipulate, isolate, and ultimately destroy employees who threatened their criminal operation, I realized these weren't just business strategies. These were the exact same tactics my family had used against me my entire life. The dismissal, the isolation, the systematic undermining of my achievements. It was all part of a calculated pattern of psychological warfare they'd perfected on their workers. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment staring at boxes of evidence that could destroy my family and finally give justice to dozens of victims. But taking this case meant declaring war against people who'd spent decades perfecting the art of crushing anyone who stood in their way. They had unlimited resources, political connections, and absolutely no moral boundaries. Going up against Harper Construction meant going up against an empire built on the destruction of people exactly like me. But as I thought about Jake's injured coworker and all the other workers who'd been robbed, hurt, and silenced by my family's greed, I realized this wasn't really a choice. This was why I'd become a lawyer. This was why I'd sacrificed everything to pursue justice instead of profit. My parents had dismissed me as the disappointing daughter for 32 years. But now I had the power to show them exactly what their disappointment could accomplish. I decided to give my family one chance to do the right thing before taking the evidence public. Maybe some naive part of me still believed that confronting them with proof of their crimes would shock them into remorse and reform. I requested a family dinner at their mansion, claiming I had important business matters to discuss. The irony of finally being invited to talk business after years of dismissal wasn't lost on me as I drove through the gates of their estate. The Harper mansion was exactly as I remembered: imposing, cold, and designed to intimidate visitors into submission. Derek's luxury cars filled the circular driveway, and I could see my parents through the floor-to-ceiling windows, dressed in expensive suits and radiating the confidence that came from never facing real consequences for their actions. They had no idea that their disappointing daughter was about to detonate a bomb that would destroy everything they'd built. Dinner conversation started with the usual condescending small talk about my cute little law practice and Derek's latest business triumphs. My father monopolized the conversation with stories about new construction contracts and expansion plans, while my mother nodded approvingly and made occasional comments about how proud she was of her successful men. I sat there pushing food around my plate, waiting for the right moment to destroy their comfortable delusions. When dessert arrived, I pulled out a manila folder containing copies of the most damning evidence Jake had provided. I need to discuss some irregularities I've discovered about Harper Construction's business practices, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. The room fell silent as I spread documents across their elegant dining table, each page representing another crime they'd committed against their own employees. My father's face transformed from confusion to rage as he recognized the payroll records, safety reports, and recorded conversations. "Where the hell did you get these?" he demanded, his voice rising to a dangerous level. "These are private company documents, and you have no right to them." Derek leaned over to examine the papers, his face pale as he realized the scope of what I'd uncovered. "I'm giving you one opportunity to make this right," I said, maintaining eye contact with each of them. "Immediately implement fair wage practices, provide proper safety equipment, and establish a victim compensation fund for the workers you've injured and cheated. Do this voluntarily, and I'll consider keeping this evidence confidential while you work to reform your company." The explosion of rage that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 32 years of disappointing my family. My father slammed his fist on the table so hard the wine glasses shattered, screaming about betrayal and ingratitude while his face turned dangerous shades of red. "You ungrateful little bitch," he roared. "After everything we've given you, this is how you repay us? By stealing confidential documents and threatening your own family?" My mother's reaction was more calculated and therefore more chilling. She dabbed her eyes with a napkin and spoke in the wounded voice of a martyred saint. "Madison, honey, I don't understand how you could do this to us," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "We're your family. We love you. How can you choose strangers over your own blood? This will destroy everything we've worked for, everything we've built for future generations." But Derek's response revealed the true depth of their criminal mindset. Instead of showing any remorse for the workers they'd cheated and injured, he immediately started strategizing about damage control and retaliation. "We need to find out who leaked these documents," he said coldly. "Then we destroy their credibility and make sure they never work in this industry again. As for Madison, she's clearly having some kind of mental breakdown. We should look into having her declared incompetent." That suggestion sent chills down my spine because I recognized the same psychological warfare tactics from his employee manipulation files. Derek wasn't just threatening to discredit me professionally, he was preparing to have me institutionalized to prevent me from exposing their crimes. The brother I'd grown up with was willing to have his own sister declared mentally incompetent to protect his criminal enterprise. The conversation deteriorated into threats and ultimatums that revealed how my family really viewed relationships. Love was conditional on loyalty, and loyalty meant complicity in whatever crimes they deemed necessary for profit. My father informed me that I had 48 hours to return all evidence and sign a non-disclosure agreement, or I would be cut off permanently from this family and everything that comes with the Harper name. "You think you're so smart with your fancy law degree," my father continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "But you're nothing without this family. You're a failure who can't even keep a real law practice running. Without our name and connections, you'll be back to waiting tables within 6 months." Derek nodded along, adding his own assessment of my character flaws and professional incompetence. When I refused to back down and explained that I intended to file a federal lawsuit regardless of their threats, the mask finally dropped completely. These people who'd raised me, who'd attended my school plays and graduation ceremonies, who'd claimed to love me despite their disappointment, revealed themselves as ruthless criminals who viewed their own daughter as an enemy to be destroyed. My mother's tears dried up instantly as she laid out their retaliation strategy with chilling precision. "If you proceed with this insanity," she said, "we'll make sure every lawyer in Texas knows you're an unstable woman who steals confidential documents and attacks the family that supported her education. We'll have your law license revoked, your credit destroyed, and your reputation so damaged you'll never recover." Derek's contribution was even more personal and vicious. "I'll make sure everyone knows about your mental health issues," he said with a smile that made my skin crawl. "Your anxiety attacks, your depression after law school, your inability to maintain relationships. I'll paint a picture of a disturbed woman who's jealous of her successful family and willing to destroy them for attention. As I gathered my evidence and prepared to leave, my father delivered his final ultimatum. "You have 48 hours to come to your senses," he said. "Return those documents, sign our agreement, and apologize for this betrayal. If you don't, you're dead to us. No family support, no family name recognition, no safety net when your pathetic little crusade fails. You'll be completely alone, and we'll make sure you stay that way." Walking out of that mansion, I felt a strange combination of heartbreak and liberation. The family that had dismissed me for 3 decades had finally shown their true colors, and their threats only confirmed that the evidence I possessed was powerful enough to destroy them. They were terrified, and their terror made them dangerous. But for the first time in my life, I understood that their opinion of me was completely irrelevant. The war had officially begun, and I was no longer fighting for their approval or acceptance. I was fighting for justice, for the workers they'd cheated, and for the part of myself that refused to be intimidated into silence. My family had taught me to expect disappointment, but they'd also accidentally taught me to survive it. That strength would prove invaluable in the battle ahead. The 48-hour ultimatum passed without any contact from my family, but their silence was more ominous than their threats. I knew they were regrouping, strategizing, and preparing to destroy me with the same systematic precision they used to crush inconvenient employees. What I didn't expect was how quickly they would turn my own allies against me, or how devastating it would feel to be betrayed by someone I trusted completely. Ashley Thompson had been my closest friend since our first year of law school. We'd studied together through countless all-nighters, supported each other through the anxiety and self-doubt that plagued every law student, and celebrated together when we both passed the bar exam. Ashley came from a working-class family like many of our classmates, and she understood the pressure of being first-generation college graduates trying to prove ourselves in a profession dominated by legacy admissions and family connections. When I called Ashley to explain the Harper Construction case and ask for her help, she seemed genuinely outraged by the evidence I'd uncovered. "Madison, this is incredible," she said after reviewing Jake Morrison's documents. "Your family has been running a criminal enterprise for years. These workers deserve justice, and you're the only lawyer brave enough to fight for them." Her enthusiasm felt like a lifeline after the isolation and threats from my family. Ashley offered to help research similar cases and identify precedents that could strengthen our legal strategy. She volunteered to interview additional workers who might have evidence of Harper Construction's crimes, and she suggested we split the massive workload involved in building a federal case against such a well-connected company. Having a skilled ally with fresh perspective felt like a gift from heaven. For 3 weeks, Ashley worked tirelessly on the case. She spent evenings in my cramped office above the dry cleaner, organizing evidence and developing arguments that were genuinely brilliant. She interviewed a dozen former Harper Construction employees and uncovered additional examples of wage theft and safety violations that strengthened our position significantly. I began to believe that maybe I wasn't as alone in this fight as my family wanted me to believe. Ashley's legal research was particularly impressive. She identified federal statutes I hadn't considered and found case precedents that could help us overcome the jurisdictional challenges my family would certainly raise. She developed a timeline of Harper Construction's crimes that was so detailed and comprehensive it read like a prosecutor's dream. Most importantly, she helped me understand that we had enough evidence to interest federal agencies in investigating tax fraud and racketeering charges. The strategy sessions we held in my office became the highlight of my weeks. Ashley brought takeout food and we'd work late into the night, surrounded by boxes of evidence and legal briefs, building what we both believed would be an unbeatable case. She listened when I vented about my family's lifetime of dismissal and manipulation, and she validated my decision to choose justice over family loyalty. "You're incredibly brave," Ashley told me one evening as we finalized our witness list. "Most people would take the money and stay quiet, but you're willing to sacrifice everything for people who can't fight for themselves. That's what real lawyers should do." Her words meant more to me than she could know, because finally someone understood that this case was about more than personal revenge. But everything changed when I arrived at my office one morning to find the locks changed and my landlord waiting with an eviction notice. I'm sorry, Madison, he said uncomfortably. I received a call yesterday about unpaid rent and complaints from other tenants about strange smells and noise coming from your office. I have to ask you to remove your belongings immediately. The accusations were completely false, but the eviction was legal because my lease was month to month. Confused and panicked, I called Ashley to explain the situation and ask if I could store our case files at her apartment temporarily. When she didn't answer, I drove to her office in the downtown legal district. Her secretary informed me that Ashley was in a meeting with important clients but would call me back as soon as possible. Something about the secretary's uncomfortable expression made my stomach twist with apprehension. That evening, Ashley finally returned my calls with an explanation that shattered my trust and nearly destroyed my sanity. Madison, I have to step back from your case, she said, her voice strangely formal and distant. After reviewing everything more carefully, I don't think we have enough evidence to win against Harper Construction. Plus, some colleagues have raised concerns about the ethics of suing your own family. I think you should consider settling privately instead of pursuing federal charges. The sudden reversal was so complete and unexpected that I initially thought Ashley was joking or testing my resolve somehow. But as she continued explaining why the case was hopeless and why I should abandon the workers who'd trusted me with their stories, I realized something terrible had happened. This wasn't the same woman who'd spent weeks calling my family criminals and praising my courage for standing up to them. My suspicions were confirmed when I discovered that key documents had disappeared from our shared case files. Witness statements that Ashley had helped me organize were missing, along with copies of the most damaging recorded conversations between my father and Derek. Even worse, I learned from Jake Morrison that several workers who'd agreed to testify had suddenly changed their minds after receiving unexpected visits from legal representatives asking detailed questions about their involvement in the case. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I hired a private investigator to look into the sudden changes in my case. What he discovered made me physically ill. Ashley had been meeting with Derek for over 2 weeks, exchanging information about our legal strategy for a substantial consulting fee paid through one of Harper Construction's shell companies. She'd systematically stolen our evidence, compromised our witnesses, and sabotaged our case from the inside while pretending to be my closest ally. The betrayal was so complete and calculated that I spent an entire day curled up on my couch, unable to eat or think clearly. Ashley hadn't just stolen documents or revealed strategy, she'd stolen my trust, my hope, and my belief that anyone would stand with me against my family's power. The friendship I'd treasured since law school was revealed as a lie, and the ally I'd depended on was actually an enemy who'd been playing a long game of manipulation and sabotage. But the investigator's report included one crucial detail that Ashley didn't know I'd discovered. In her eagerness to collect Derek's money, she'd recorded some of their conversations on her phone as insurance against him trying to cheat her out of payment. Those recordings, captured accidentally when she forgot to turn off a voice memo app, contained Ashley's confession to everything she'd done to sabotage my case. Listening to Ashley laugh with my brother about my pathetic trust in her friendship was almost more than I could bear. But hearing her describe the workers we'd interviewed as useful idiots who deserved whatever happened to them filled me with a rage that burned away the heartbreak and self-pity. Ashley had betrayed not just me, but every worker who'd trusted her with their stories of exploitation and injury. That night, sitting alone in my empty office with no allies, no evidence, and no clear path forward, I realized my family had taught me another valuable lesson. They'd shown me how thoroughly they could corrupt anyone with the right pressure and incentives. But they'd also underestimated how far I was willing to go to rebuild what they'd destroyed. Ashley's betrayal was devastating, but it wasn't fatal. I still had Jake Morrison's original evidence, I still knew the truth about Harper Construction's crimes, and I now had proof that my family was willing to commit additional crimes to cover up their original ones. The second battle of this war was over, and I'd lost badly. But the war itself was far from finished, and now I knew exactly how ruthless my enemies were willing to be. That knowledge would make me stronger, smarter, and more careful about who I trusted. My family wanted me to feel isolated and hopeless, but instead I felt focused and determined. They'd won this round, but they'd also shown me their playbook. Next time, I would be ready. The loss of my office and the betrayal by Ashley had left me temporarily defeated but not destroyed. I spent the next 2 weeks working from my tiny apartment, rebuilding my case files from backup copies and reaching out to new potential allies who might help me take down Harper Construction. What I didn't realize was that my family had been using this time to launch the most devastating attack yet. A comprehensive character assassination campaign designed to destroy my reputation so thoroughly that no one would believe anything I said about their crimes. The first sign of their media blitz came when I opened my laptop one morning to find my email inbox flooded with messages from former clients, law school classmates, and professional contacts. They'd all received anonymous tips about my mental instability and unethical behavior that painted me as a dangerous lawyer who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. The emails included fabricated details about malpractice lawsuits, substance abuse problems, and a history of filing frivolous legal actions against innocent businesses. By noon that day, 3 local newspapers had published stories about my frivolous lawsuit against Harper Construction, characterizing it as the vindictive action of an unstable daughter seeking attention through false accusations against her successful family. The articles quoted unnamed sources who described me as jealous, manipulative, and prone to elaborate fantasies about persecution and conspiracy. None of the journalists had contacted me for comment, and none of them had examined any actual evidence from the case. The Dallas Business Journal ran a particularly damaging piece that portrayed Harper Construction as a model employer being targeted by a disgruntled family member with a history of mental health issues. The article included quotes from several construction industry leaders who praised my father's integrity and expressed concern about false accusations damaging the reputation of legitimate businesses. Derek was quoted extensively, positioning himself as the reluctant victim of his sister's psychological problems. "It breaks our hearts to see Madison struggling like this," Derek told the reporter. "We've tried to get her professional help, but she refuses to acknowledge that she needs treatment for her depression and paranoid thinking. Now she's involving innocent workers in her delusions, and we're worried about the damage she might do to their lives and careers." The quote was perfectly crafted to sound concerned and caring while planting seeds of doubt about my credibility and mental state. The social media campaign was even more sophisticated and vicious. Someone had created fake accounts that shared detailed stories about my allegedly erratic behavior in law school, my supposed drinking problems, and my history of filing baseless complaints against professors and employers. The stories were specific enough to seem credible but impossible for me to disprove because they described events that had never happened but sounded plausible to people who didn't know me well. Professional networking sites suddenly filled with negative reviews of my legal services from clients I'd never represented. The reviews described incompetent representation, missed deadlines, and ethical violations that would be grounds for disbarment if they were true. Each review was posted by an account that looked legitimate but had been created specifically to damage my reputation. The timing and coordination of these attacks made it obvious they were part of an organized campaign, but proving that would require resources I didn't possess. The most devastating blow came when I received a letter from the Texas State Bar Association informing me that they'd received multiple complaints about my professional conduct and were opening a formal investigation into my fitness to practice law. The complaints alleged that I'd stolen confidential documents, harassed opposing parties, and engaged in behavior that brought discredit to the legal profession. Each allegation was carefully crafted to seem serious enough to warrant investigation while being vague enough to be difficult to disprove quickly. While I was dealing with the professional damage from these false accusations, Derek escalated to personal attacks that targeted my safety and freedom. He arranged for me to be pulled over by police during routine traffic stops, ostensibly for minor violations like expired registration or broken taillights. During these stops, the officers would ask probing questions about my mental state and whether I was taking any medications that might impair my driving ability. The pattern became clear when I was pulled over 3 times in a single week, each time by different officers who seemed unusually interested in whether I was experiencing stress or emotional problems. They were building a paper trail that would support later claims about my mental instability. The stops were technically legal, but the coordinated nature and the specific questions they asked revealed that someone with connections was orchestrating these encounters. Derek's masterpiece was arranging for me to be arrested on false drug possession charges. While I was grocery shopping one evening, police surrounded my car in the parking lot and informed me that they'd received a tip about suspicious activity. A search of my vehicle turned up a small bag of cocaine that had been planted in my glove compartment while I was inside the store. The arrest made local news, with reporters emphasizing that I was the daughter of prominent businessman Richard Harper and noting that I'd recently filed a lawsuit against my own family's company. Spending a night in jail was a nightmare that went far beyond the physical discomfort of a cramped cell and terrible food. The other inmates had seen the news coverage and knew I was the crazy lawyer who was suing her own family. Some of them seemed to find my situation amusing, while others viewed me as a spoiled rich girl who'd finally gotten what she deserved. The isolation and humiliation were exactly what Derek had intended, a preview of what would happen if I continued fighting against Harper Construction. The drug charges were dropped when my attorney proved that the cocaine had been planted, but the damage to my reputation was already done. Local news outlets reported my arrest prominently but buried the dismissal of charges in brief paragraphs that few people would read. The public perception was that I was a drug-using lawyer who'd only escaped conviction through legal technicalities and family connections. But the most insidious part of Derek's character assassination campaign was how it poisoned my relationships with potential allies and supporters. Workers who might have been willing to testify against Harper Construction began to distance themselves, worried about being associated with someone who appeared unstable and vindictive. Lawyers who might have offered support or advice suddenly became unavailable when I called, clearly concerned about their own reputations being damaged by association with me. The cumulative effect of these attacks was exactly what my family had intended. Complete isolation from professional and personal support systems that might have helped me continue the fight against their criminal empire. They'd systematically destroyed my credibility, damaged my professional standing, and created a public narrative that portrayed me as an unstable woman whose accusations couldn't be trusted. Sitting in my apartment that night after being released from jail, surrounded by newspaper clippings that painted me as a delusional criminal, I felt closer to giving up than I ever had before. My family had shown me that they possessed unlimited resources for destroying anyone who threatened them, and they were willing to use those resources against their own daughter without hesitation or remorse. But even in my darkest moment, I remembered something that gave me strength. Jake Morrison had warned me that Harper Construction always tried to destroy whistleblowers through character assassination before they resorted to physical threats or violence. The fact that they were working so hard to discredit me meant they were still afraid of the evidence I possessed. Their desperation was showing, and desperate people made mistakes that could be exploited by someone patient enough to wait for the right opportunity. The character assassination campaign had achieved everything my family intended and more. Within 2 months of their media blitz, my law practice had completely collapsed as clients fled in terror of being associated with a lawyer portrayed as mentally unstable and professionally incompetent. The few remaining clients I had terminated their contracts after reading news stories about my arrest and the ethics investigation. Even cases where I'd been winning were abandoned as clients decided they'd rather lose with a different lawyer than risk having their names connected to mine. The financial consequences were swift and devastating. Without income from my practice, I couldn't afford the rent on my apartment, my car payments, or even basic necessities like food and utilities. My landlord served me with an eviction notice exactly 30 days after the first newspaper story ran, claiming that my legal troubles violated the moral character clause in my lease agreement. The bank repossessed my car 2 weeks later, leaving me dependent on public transportation to travel around a city designed for automobile owners. Moving into a cheap motel on the outskirts of Dallas was one of the most humiliating experiences of my adult life. The Desert Rose Motor Lodge was the kind of place where people paid by the week and minded their own business about what their neighbors were running from. My room smelled like cigarettes and disinfectant, the air conditioning unit leaked constantly, and the walls were so thin I could hear every conversation, argument, and television program from the adjoining rooms. This was my new reality. A 32-year-old lawyer with a degree from a prestigious university living in a place that most people would use only in the most desperate circumstances. The stress of losing everything while fighting a battle I seemed destined to lose began taking a serious toll on my physical and mental health. I started experiencing panic attacks that would strike without warning, leaving me gasping for breath and feeling like my chest was being crushed by invisible weights. The episodes were most severe when I tried to work on the Harper Construction case, as if my body was rejecting the trauma of fighting against people who'd shown they were willing to destroy me completely. Sleep became almost impossible as my mind raced through endless scenarios of additional ways my family might attack me. Every phone call could be another journalist wanting to write about my downfall, every knock on the door could be police with new fabricated charges, every unexpected noise could be someone my family had hired to intimidate me into silence. The hypervigilance was exhausting, but I couldn't turn it off because the threats were real and ongoing. Eating became a challenge both financially and psychologically. I could barely afford basic groceries, and the stress had destroyed my appetite to the point where food tasted like cardboard and made my stomach churn. I lost 20 pounds in 6 weeks, and my clothes hung on my frame like I was playing dress-up in someone else's wardrobe. People who recognized me on the street would stare with expressions that combined curiosity and pity, clearly wondering how the daughter of wealthy Richard Harper had fallen so far so fast. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of my new reality. Friends who'd been supportive initially began avoiding my calls as the negative publicity intensified and the social cost of association with me became clear. Law school classmates who'd once eagerly discussed career opportunities suddenly became too busy to meet for coffee or return messages. Even casual acquaintances seemed uncomfortable when they encountered me, rushing through brief conversations before finding excuses to leave quickly. My family's final blow came in the form of a press conference that aired on local news stations during prime viewing hours. My parents, dressed in their most expensive and conservative clothing, stood behind a podium at Harper Construction headquarters while Derek read a prepared statement expressing their deep sadness and concern about my mental health crisis and their commitment to getting their beloved daughter the professional help she desperately needs. Madison has been struggling with depression and paranoid thinking for several years, my mother told the assembled reporters, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. We've tried everything to help her, including offering to pay for psychiatric treatment and medication management. But she refuses to acknowledge that she has a problem, and now her delusions are hurting innocent people who work for our company. The performance was flawless, portraying them as heartbroken parents dealing with a troubled adult child. Derek's contribution to the press conference was particularly calculated and cruel. My sister has always been jealous of my success at the family business, he said. She wanted to join the company after law school, but she wasn't qualified for the leadership positions she demanded. Instead of accepting that and building her own career, she's created this elaborate fantasy where we're criminals who've stolen from workers. It's a heartbreaking example of how mental illness can distort reality and hurt everyone involved. The worst part of watching that press conference wasn't the lies they told about me, it was seeing how convincing they were as grieving parents and how sympathetic the reporters seemed to their supposed plight. They'd positioned themselves as the victims of their daughter's mental breakdown, and the media had completely bought their narrative. Several reporters asked follow-up questions about what resources were available for families dealing with similar situations, treating my parents like experts on supporting mentally ill relatives. That night, sitting alone in my motel room watching my family destroy what remained of my reputation on television, I came closer to giving up than I ever had before. The evidence I'd gathered against Harper Construction seemed meaningless when no one would believe anything I said. The workers I'd promised to help were probably better off without being associated with a lawyer the entire city viewed as unstable and vindictive. For the first time since this battle began, I seriously considered taking the settlement offer my family had made through their attorneys. They were willing to pay me a substantial sum to sign a non-disclosure agreement and check myself into a private psychiatric facility for treatment of my supposed mental health issues. The money would be enough to start over somewhere else, maybe in a different state where no one knew about my legal troubles or family connections. But even in my darkest moment, I couldn't forget about Jake Morrison and the other workers who'd trusted me with their stories of exploitation and abuse. They'd risked their jobs and their safety to provide evidence against Harper Construction, and abandoning them now would make me complicit in the ongoing crimes my family was committing. More importantly, giving up would validate everything my parents had always believed about me, that I was weak, unreliable, and destined to disappoint anyone who depended on me. The decision to continue fighting came when I was lying on the lumpy motel bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling and listening to my neighbors argue about money through the thin walls. These people living in weekly motels, working multiple minimum wage jobs and struggling to survive, were exactly the kind of people Harper Construction had been cheating for years. My family's crimes weren't abstract legal theories. They were real injustices that destroyed real lives and kept vulnerable people trapped in poverty and desperation. I realized that my own suffering, as devastating as it felt, was temporary and survivable. But the workers my family had cheated and injured would continue suffering until someone with the knowledge and determination to stop Harper Construction actually did something about it. I might be broken, isolated, and nearly defeated, but I was still the only person with access to evidence that could bring them justice. That realization didn't make the pain disappear or solve my immediate problems, but it gave me a reason to keep fighting that was bigger than my own desire for vindication. My family had successfully isolated me from allies and destroyed my reputation, but they hadn't changed the fundamental facts about their criminal behavior. The truth was still the truth, regardless of how many people they'd convinced to ignore it. The turning point came 3 weeks after my family's press conference, when Jake Morrison appeared at my motel room door with news that would transform my desperate situation into the foundation for their ultimate destruction. He'd been watching the character assassination campaign with growing anger, and he'd decided that Harper Construction's treatment of me was final proof that they would never voluntarily stop destroying people who threatened their profits. "I've been talking to other workers," Jake said as he sat across from me at the tiny table in my room. "Guys who were too scared to come forward before are furious about what your family is doing to you. They see how they're treating their own daughter, and they realize none of us are safe if we don't stop them now." He'd brought 3 other men with him, all former Harper Construction employees who'd witnessed crimes but had been too intimidated to speak publicly about them. The new evidence they provided was even more damning than the original documents Jake had shared with me. Marcus Thompson, a former site supervisor, had kept detailed records of safety violations that had resulted in worker injuries. His files included photographs of defective equipment that Harper Construction had refused to replace despite knowing it posed serious risks to employees. He'd also recorded conversations where Derek had explicitly ordered him to ignore OSHA regulations and lie to safety inspectors. Carlos Martinez had worked in the company's accounting department and had copies of financial records that proved Harper Construction was systematically underreporting income to avoid paying proper taxes. His evidence included bank statements, invoices for non-existent services, and correspondence between my mother and offshore banking officials about hiding assets in foreign accounts. The tax fraud was so extensive that it constituted a federal crime with potential prison sentences measured in decades. But the most devastating new evidence came from Robert Chen, who'd worked directly with Derek on construction projects throughout the city. Robert had secretly recorded dozens of conversations where Derek discussed bribing city officials, intimidating workers, and covering up accidents that should have been reported to authorities. In one particularly damning recording, Derek laughed about a worker who'd been permanently disabled in an on-site accident and joked about getting rid of employees who asked too many questions about safety procedures. As I reviewed the mountain of new evidence, I realized my family's attacks on me had actually made our case stronger by demonstrating their willingness to commit additional crimes to cover up their original ones. Their character assassination campaign was itself a criminal conspiracy that involved bribing journalists, filing false police reports, and tampering with witnesses. Every move they'd made against me could be used to prove their consciousness of guilt and their ongoing criminal enterprise. The workers who'd come forward were willing to testify in court despite the obvious risks to their safety and employment prospects. They'd seen how Harper Construction treated people who threatened them, and they understood that staying silent would only enable more workers to be cheated and injured in the future. Their courage in the face of such powerful enemies reminded me why this fight was worth the personal cost I'd paid. But I knew that local authorities would never be sufficient to take down an operation as sophisticated and well-connected as Harper Construction. The evidence we'd gathered pointed to federal crimes that required intervention from agencies with the resources and independence to challenge my family's political connections. That's when I made the decision to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service about launching a comprehensive investigation into Harper Construction's criminal activities. The FBI agent who agreed to meet with me was Special Agent Diana Rodriguez, a veteran investigator who specialized in white-collar crime and public corruption cases. Agent Rodriguez listened patiently as I explained the evidence we'd gathered and the retaliation I'd faced for exposing Harper Construction's crimes. Her questions were thorough and professional, focusing on the strength of our documentation and the credibility of our witnesses rather than the media stories about my supposed mental instability. "This is exactly the kind of systematic fraud we're equipped to investigate," Agent Rodriguez told me after reviewing our evidence. "But you need to understand that federal cases take time to build properly, and companies like Harper Construction have resources to fight back in ways that could be dangerous for you personally. Are you prepared for this investigation to take years and for the retaliation to get much worse before it gets better?" The answer was unquestionably yes. After everything my family had already done to destroy me, I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from seeing them face real consequences for their crimes. Agent Rodriguez explained that the FBI would need to conduct their own investigation to corroborate our evidence, but that they had resources for protecting witnesses and building cases that could withstand the most aggressive legal challenges. The IRS investigation was equally promising. Agent Sarah Kim from the Criminal Investigation Division was fascinated by the evidence of tax fraud and money laundering that Carlos Martinez had provided. "Your mother is incredibly sophisticated in her methods," Agent Kim told me. "But she's also been keeping detailed records of everything, probably because she never thought anyone would have access to them. These documents are exactly what we need to prove criminal intent and trace the money through the entire network of shell companies." Within 2 weeks, both investigations were officially opened and federal agents were conducting their own evidence-gathering operations. Harper Construction was suddenly dealing with subpoenas for financial records, surprise inspections of their construction sites, and interviews with current and former employees who were now under federal protection. My family's comfortable assumption that they were above the law was being challenged by agencies that had successfully prosecuted powerful criminals across the country. The federal investigations also attracted the attention of investigative journalists who specialized in exposing corporate corruption. Maria Santos from the Dallas Observer had been following white-collar crime in Texas for over a decade, and she recognized that the Harper Construction case represented a perfect example of how wealthy families could commit crimes with impunity until federal authorities stepped in. Her articles about the investigation were thoroughly researched and carefully documented, presenting a stark contrast to the character assassination pieces that had dominated local media coverage. As the federal investigations gained momentum, public opinion began shifting in ways that vindicated everything I'd endured over the past months. Workers from other construction companies came forward with similar stories about Harper Construction's practices, and the pattern of systematic fraud became impossible to ignore. City officials who'd received bribes from my family were suddenly under investigation themselves, creating a domino effect that exposed corruption throughout the local construction industry. The most satisfying development came when Ashley Thompson contacted me through an intermediary, offering to provide evidence about Derek's witness tampering and obstruction of justice in exchange for immunity from prosecution. She'd realized that her cooperation with Harper Construction made her complicit in federal crimes, and she was desperate to save herself from potential prison time. Her recorded conversations with Derek, which she'd kept as insurance against being cheated out of her payment, became crucial evidence in the federal case. For the first time since this battle began, I felt like I was fighting from a position of strength rather than desperation. The evidence against Harper Construction was overwhelming. Federal agencies were committed to pursuing justice, and public support was growing as people learned the truth about my family's crimes. My reputation was being slowly rehabilitated as investigative journalists revealed how thoroughly I'd been slandered by a family trying to cover up their own criminal behavior. But the most important victory was personal rather than legal. After months of isolation, humiliation, and financial devastation, I'd found a community of allies who shared my commitment to justice and weren't afraid to stand up against powerful criminals. The workers who'd trusted me with their stories, the federal agents who'd believed in our evidence, and the journalists who'd investigated our claims had proven that truth and justice could still prevail against money and political connections. My family had taught me to expect disappointment and betrayal from the people closest to me, but this experience had shown me that strangers could demonstrate more loyalty and integrity than blood relatives. The chosen family I'd built through shared commitment to justice was stronger and more reliable than the biological family that had rejected me for refusing to participate in their crimes. The federal investigations had been proceeding for 8 months when Special Agent Rodriguez called with the news I'd been waiting for. "We have enough evidence to file criminal charges against your father, mother, and brother," she said. "The grand jury has approved indictments for racketeering, tax fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. We're also charging Derek with witness tampering and obstruction of justice for his attempts to sabotage your case." The formal charges would be announced within days, and trials were expected to begin within 6 months. But Agent Rodriguez also delivered news that was both thrilling and terrifying. "The federal prosecutors want you to represent the workers in a civil lawsuit that will run parallel to the criminal case," she explained. "Your law license has been fully reinstated now that the ethics charges were proven false, and the victims deserve someone who understands their experiences and genuinely cares about getting them justice." This was the opportunity I dreamed of, the chance to not only clear my name but to personally ensure that Harper Construction's victims received the compensation they deserved. Preparing for what would essentially be the most important case of my legal career required rebuilding my entire professional life from scratch. With the help of a loan from a legal aid organization that supported attorneys fighting corporate corruption, I was able to rent proper office space and hire a small staff to help manage the massive amount of evidence and documentation required for federal court. My new office was modest but functional, and walking into a professional space that belonged to me felt like emerging from a nightmare into sunlight. The civil lawsuit we filed on behalf of Harper Construction's victims was comprehensive and devastating. We documented 15 years of wage theft affecting over 300 workers, safety violations that had caused 12 serious injuries and 3 deaths, and systematic fraud that had cost the city of Dallas millions of dollars in unpaid taxes and fees. The financial damages we requested totaled over $50 million, but the real value of the case was its potential to set precedents that would protect future workers from similar exploitation. My family's initial response to the federal charges was predictably arrogant and defiant. They hired the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in Texas and immediately began a media campaign portraying themselves as victims of federal overreach and prosecutorial abuse. Derek gave interviews claiming that vindictive federal agents had been manipulated by his mentally unstable sister into pursuing baseless charges against innocent business owners. But their confidence began cracking when the evidence became public through court filings and media coverage. The recorded conversations where Derek discussed bribing officials and covering up worker injuries were played on local news programs, finally allowing the public to hear his actual voice admitting to crimes rather than his carefully crafted denials. My mother's detailed financial records of money laundering operations were published in investigative reports that showed the sophisticated nature of their criminal enterprise. The most satisfying moment came when Derek attempted to intimidate me one final time, approaching me in the parking garage of the federal courthouse after a pre-trial hearing. "You think you've won something," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "But even if you destroy our business, you'll never be accepted by this family again. You'll always be the daughter who betrayed her own blood for strangers." His threats were being recorded by federal agents for evidence of continued obstruction, but I barely cared about the legal implications. "Derek," I replied, looking him directly in the eyes without fear for the first time in my adult life, I stopped caring about this family's acceptance the moment I realized you were willing to steal food from children to increase your profit margins. The workers you've cheated are worth more than all the Harper family approval I'll never receive." The security footage of that conversation, which showed Derek physically threatening me while federal agents intervened, became crucial evidence of his ongoing criminal mindset. My parents' reactions to the impending trials revealed the true nature of their relationship and their complete lack of remorse for the lives they destroyed. My father blamed my mother for keeping inadequate records of their money laundering operations, while she accused him of being reckless with bribes and witness intimidation. Derek positioned himself as a victim of his parents' poor guidance, claiming he'd been forced to participate in crimes he didn't understand or support. The most shocking development came when my mother attempted suicide 3 weeks before the trials were scheduled to begin. She was found in her mansion's bathroom by housekeeping staff who discovered her unconscious from an overdose of prescription medications. The suicide attempt generated massive media coverage that painted Harper Construction's crimes in an even more damning light, as reporters noted that innocent business owners don't typically try to kill themselves when facing scrutiny. My father's response to his wife's suicide attempt was so callous it surprised even me. Instead of expressing concern for her mental health or taking responsibility for the stress their criminal activities had caused, he immediately began strategizing about how to use her hospitalization to gain sympathy from potential jurors. "Susan's breakdown proves how much stress these false accusations have put on our family," he told reporters outside the hospital. "My wife is a gentle woman who's never hurt anyone, and these charges have literally driven her to attempt suicide." The final pre-trial development was my father's desperate attempt to flee the country with stolen assets hidden in offshore accounts. Federal agents arrested him at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport as he was attempting to board a private jet to a non-extradition country. The arrest was captured by airport security cameras and broadcast on national news programs, finally destroying any remaining public sympathy for Harper Construction's leadership. Derek's last-minute plea bargain negotiations revealed the depth of his cowardice and the strength of the federal case against him. Faced with potential prison sentences of 30 years or more, he offered to testify against our parents in exchange for reduced charges and a recommendation for minimum sentencing. His willingness to betray his own parents to save himself demonstrated that Harper Construction's culture of ruthlessness extended to every relationship, including those between family members. But the most important preparation for the upcoming trials was rebuilding my own confidence and professional skills after months of being portrayed as an incompetent and unstable lawyer. The federal prosecutors treating me as an equal partner in seeking justice, the workers trusting me to represent their interests, and the media covering my legal arguments with respect rather than ridicule proved that my family's character assassination campaign had failed completely. Ashley Thompson's cooperation with federal investigators provided the final pieces of evidence needed to prove Derek's obstruction of justice charges. Her recorded conversations revealed the systematic nature of his attempts to sabotage my case and intimidate witnesses, and her testimony would be crucial in demonstrating that Harper Construction's retaliation against me was part of their ongoing criminal enterprise rather than a family dispute. As I sat in my rebuilt office the night before the trials were scheduled to begin, surrounded by boxes of evidence and legal briefs that represented months of intensive preparation, I felt a sense of calm determination that had been absent from my life for over a year. My family had taught me to expect disappointment and defeat, but this experience had proven that justice was possible when people with integrity were willing to fight for it against overwhelming odds. The scared, isolated woman who'd been living in a motel 6 months earlier had been transformed into a competent attorney representing federal prosecutors and dozens of exploited workers in one of the most significant white-collar crime cases in Texas history. My family's attempts to destroy me had instead created the foundation for their own destruction and my personal redemption. The morning of the trial, I stood once again on the courthouse steps where this journey had begun over a year earlier. But everything was different now. Instead of trembling hands clutching desperate evidence, I carried myself with the confidence of an attorney who'd rebuilt her career from ashes and emerged stronger than ever. The media crowd was massive, with reporters from national news organizations covering what had become one of the most significant white-collar crime prosecutions in Texas history. And there were my parents, arriving in handcuffs rather than luxury cars, their faces showing the first real fear I'd ever seen from them. Walking into that packed courtroom felt like entering a cathedral of justice where truth would finally triumph over power and corruption. The gallery was filled with Harper Construction workers and their families, federal agents who'd investigated the case, journalists covering the trial, and curious observers drawn by the spectacle of a wealthy family's complete downfall. Judge Margaret Foster, the honorable jurist who would oversee both the criminal and civil proceedings, commanded respect from everyone in her courtroom with her reputation for fairness and her intolerance for legal games or manipulation. My parents still carried themselves with arrogance as they entered the courtroom, my father nodding to reporters like he was attending a social event rather than facing decades in federal prison. My mother looked frail and medicated following her suicide attempt, but her eyes still held the cold calculation that had characterized her money laundering operations. Derek appeared terrified and kept glancing around the courtroom like he was looking for escape routes or allies who might save him from the consequences of his crimes. When Judge Foster called the court to order and I rose to deliver the opening statement for the civil case representing Harper Construction's victims, I felt the weight of every person whose life had been damaged by my family's greed. But I also felt the strength that came from knowing I was finally in a position to deliver the justice they deserved. This moment represented the culmination of everything I'd endured and learned during the most difficult year of my life. Your Honor, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, the evidence will show that Harper Construction operated as a criminal enterprise that systematically stole from workers, endangered lives through deliberate safety violations, and corrupted public officials to avoid accountability for their crimes. The defendants sitting at that table aren't just business owners who made poor decisions. They're sophisticated criminals who spent 15 years perfecting methods of exploiting vulnerable people while hiding behind a facade of respectability and community leadership. As I outlined the evidence of wage theft, safety violations, and financial fraud, I watched my family's expensive defense attorneys realize that their usual tactics of attacking accusers' credibility would be useless against the mountain of documentation and recorded conversations we'd assembled. The federal prosecutors had done their job perfectly, building a case so comprehensive and well-documented that denial was impossible and deflection was futile. The testimony phase of the trial was a masterclass in how justice could prevail when victims were given the platform and protection they needed to tell their stories. Worker after worker took the stand to describe how Harper Construction had cheated them out of wages, forced them to work in dangerous conditions, and retaliated against anyone who complained about illegal practices. Their stories were heartbreaking but also empowering, as each witness demonstrated the courage required to stand up against powerful criminals who'd threatened their livelihoods and safety. Jake Morrison's testimony was particularly powerful as he walked the jury through the systematic nature of Harper Construction's crimes and the sophisticated methods they'd used to hide their illegal activities from authorities. His presentation of evidence was methodical and devastating, leaving no doubt that these weren't isolated incidents or mistakes but deliberate criminal policies implemented at the highest levels of the company. The most dramatic moment came when the federal prosecutors played Derek's recorded conversations about bribing officials, covering up worker injuries, and intimidating employees who questioned company practices. Hearing his own voice admitting to crimes while laughing about the suffering of injured workers visibly shocked the jury and eliminated any remaining sympathy they might have had for Harper Construction's leadership. Derek's face turned pale as his recorded words filled the courtroom, finally confronting him with the reality of his own cruelty and criminality. My mother's financial records were equally damning as federal accounting experts walked the jury through the sophisticated money laundering operation she'd designed to hide Harper Construction's profits and avoid paying taxes. The complexity and deliberate nature of the fraud demonstrated that this wasn't incompetence or oversight but calculated criminal behavior that had deprived public services of millions of dollars while enriching my family at the expense of the community they claimed to serve. Ashley Thompson's testimony about Derek's witness tampering and obstruction efforts provided crucial evidence of the ongoing criminal enterprise's willingness to commit additional crimes to cover up their original offenses. Her detailed account of how Derek had hired her to sabotage my case, intimidate witnesses, and destroy evidence proved that Harper Construction viewed legal accountability as just another business problem to be solved through criminal means. The defense's attempts to portray my family as victims of an overzealous prosecution driven by a vindictive daughter fell apart when confronted with the overwhelming evidence of systematic criminality spanning over a decade. Their character assassination campaign against me had been so thoroughly debunked by federal investigators that even raising questions about my credibility made their arguments seem desperate and dishonest. When the jury returned after 3 days of deliberation, their verdicts were swift and comprehensive. Richard Harper was found guilty on all charges including racketeering, tax fraud, and conspiracy, with a recommended sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Susan Harper received 15 years for money laundering and tax fraud. Derek's convictions included additional charges for witness tampering and obstruction of justice, earning him a 30-year sentence that reflected his leadership role in the criminal enterprise and his attempts to cover up their crimes. The civil lawsuit resulted in a judgment of over $60 million in damages to be paid to Harper Construction's victims, with additional punitive damages that would effectively bankrupt the company and force the sale of all family assets including their mansion, luxury cars, and offshore accounts. But beyond the financial compensation, the civil victory established legal precedents that would protect future workers from similar exploitation and give them stronger tools for fighting back against corporate criminals. As I watched my family being led away in handcuffs to begin serving their prison sentences, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and satisfaction that I'd never expected. These people had raised me, attended my school plays, and been part of every significant moment of my childhood. But they'd also chosen greed over family loyalty, criminality over integrity, and cruelty over compassion in ways that had destroyed not just their victims but ultimately themselves. The months following the trial were a period of rebuilding and reflection that taught me profound lessons about justice, family, and personal strength that I never could have learned any other way. The workers I'd represented used their settlements to rebuild lives that Harper Construction had nearly destroyed, and many became advocates for stronger labor protections and corporate accountability. Seeing their transformation from victims to empowered activists proved that justice wasn't just about punishment but about giving people the tools they needed to prevent future exploitation. My own healing journey involved learning to forgive myself for the years I'd spent seeking approval from people who were fundamentally incapable of genuine love or respect. The family that had dismissed me as their greatest disappointment had actually taught me the most valuable lessons of my life about courage, integrity, and the difference between loyalty and complicity. Their rejection had forced me to develop strength I never knew I possessed and to find my worth in serving justice rather than seeking acceptance. The nonprofit legal clinic I established with part of my legal fees from the case became a beacon of hope for workers facing exploitation by powerful employers. We provided free representation to people who couldn't afford attorneys, education about labor rights and safety protections, and advocacy for stronger laws to prevent corporate abuse of vulnerable populations. Every case we won felt like another victory over the mindset that had driven my family to view other people as expendable resources for their enrichment. But the most important lesson I learned from this entire experience was that justice isn't about revenge against people who've wronged you, it's about protecting others from experiencing the pain and exploitation you've endured. My family's crimes had caused immeasurable suffering to dozens of families, and stopping their criminal enterprise was about ensuring that no other workers would be cheated, injured, or intimidated by Harper Construction's ruthless practices. Sometimes the family you're born into teaches you exactly who you don't want to become, and sometimes that's the most valuable education you can receive. My parents and Derek showed me that money without morality is meaningless, that power without compassion is destructive, and that family loyalty should never require participation in causing harm to innocent people. They taught me these lessons by demonstrating the opposite of everything I wanted to be. The chosen family I built through this fight, the workers who trusted me with their stories, the federal agents who believed in justice, the journalists who pursued truth despite pressure to ignore it, proved that real relationships are based on shared values rather than shared DNA. These people had shown me more loyalty, respect, and genuine care than my biological family had ever provided, and they'd done it without expecting anything in return except my continued commitment to fighting for what was right. Standing in my rebuilt office a year after the trials ended, surrounded by thank you letters from workers whose lives had been transformed by their settlements and photographs of the legal clinic that bore my name, I realized that my parents had been right about one thing. I had always been different from the rest of the Harper family. But that difference wasn't the weakness and disappointment they'd claimed. It was my greatest strength and the foundation for a life dedicated to justice rather than profit. What do you think would have happened if I'd chosen family loyalty over justice for those workers? Have you ever had to choose between doing what's right and protecting people you love? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences help other viewers feel less alone in their own difficult situations. If this story resonated with you, please smash that like button and subscribe for more real-life tales of courage and redemption that prove ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who might need to hear that standing up for what's right is always worth the cost, no matter how high the price might seem. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey, and remember that your courage to speak truth to power might be exactly what someone else needs to find their own strength to fight back against injustice.